It's good to finally play this game again. Out of all the weird garbage, but not so garbage games I grew up with, which is easily one of my favorites. Opposed to, i.e. the Totally Spies and Disney Princess games I covered last year, this game actually has some thought behind it, and is a lot more memorable than those 2-hour-long adventures. So memorable that I forgot I played it during my childhood, until user Luderzucker posted a comment about it on my Disney Princess video. My entire life started flashing before my eyes, and all I could think about was this damn spider that I was never able to beat, and ultimately made me give up on this game altogether as a kid. Even with that in mind, I remember this game being nothing but a blast. Flying around with elemental guardians, using their powers to manipulate the environment and destroy every enemy blocking my path. Having those otherworldly powers just hits different as a small child, and I kept resetting and replaying the game countless times, starting over as soon as I reached the insurmountable Spider-Man. I consider the game to be one of the most fun GBA games I have ever played, but I was never able to beat the entire thing. Now, about 20 years later, that just didn't sit right with me anymore. The spider that had been tormenting me all my life had to be conquered. Not only to finally see the game's ending, but also to see how much the illusion of this being a good game could be shattered. And thus I set out on a quest to finally beat this children's game once and for all. As I continue this trip through the catalog of my childhood, which in turn continues the common denominator of the games in said catalog being an afterthought of already established franchises. Originally starting as an Italian comic, which revolves around this group of young girls, consisting of Will, Irma, Tyranny, Cornelia, and Hey Lynn. Huh? Oh. I don't know. I kinda like the idea. Despite the names of these 5 girls forming the titular acronym, they aren't actually witches, but elemental guardians entrusted with the protection of Earth from various evil forces. Now, that's about as far as my knowledge of the series goes, as their target demographic was mostly girls under the age of 10. And I wasn't part of that last time I checked. Now, while they didn't reel me in at the time, the series was a great success. 139 main series issues and 16 special issues were released between 2001 and 2012 in no fewer than 65 countries. Alongside pretty much any other hit series ever created, which too branched out into other media to milk every single last drop out of the figurative cow. It branched out into an animated version of the series in 2004 and also got what would be its one and only video game adaptation in 2005. While looking for some background information on the entire thing, I sadly also found out about the creators, Alessandro Barbucci and Barbara Canepa, falling victim to Disney's scummy publisher bullshit we all know and hate. These two left Disney around 2004, stating being fed up with participating in depressing marketing meetings, working in an environment where quantity is valued over quality, and were all but encouraged to progress professionally and artistically. They then ended up suing Disney for the rights to the very thing they created. And lost. To make matters worse, Disney then in turn tried suing fucking Winx Club for copying Witch once that series took off. Don't you love the hypocritical video game worlds? I certainly do. Those absolute fucking losers ended up losing the lawsuit against Winx Club, but sadly still own the rights to Witch to this day. Which is rather sad and unfortunate. So, yeah, Witch branching out into an animated series and a video game was just Disney milking something that wasn't theirs. Surprise, surprise. Now, while I can't speak for the animated series, as I haven't watched a single episode nor am I planning to do so in the near future, the game reflects Barbucci's and Canepa's comments on Disney's quantity over quality output relatively well. Though I must admit I had a good time playing through it again after all these years, whether that's being influenced by nostalgia or not. Which the video game revolves around this Emperor Palpatine wannabe Phobos, who's looking for world domination as per usual in these types of games. In order to do so, he supposedly needs these 4 elemental stones and a key to obtain the same elemental powers as the witch girls. For the sake of plot development, he of course ends up obtaining these, and at the end of the game you fight and beat him in this avatar-like form. And that's pretty much all there is to it, apart from the game tying loose ends together as if it threw darts at a wall while blindfolded. Like at some point they head over to one of the girls' grandma to get her to explain what the hell is going on and how they can save the world. But then, and you're not gonna believe this, they suddenly remember they have a random ass party to go to that's supposedly more important than the world's destruction. A party during which the stones are lying on the kitchen table and randomly get stolen by a Smeagol looking dude that has no special powers to open a locked safe or anything, of course. This absolute legend then ends up trading the stones for a slinky spring as well. The story's so fucking dumb that it's good. After this series of unfortunate but hilarious events, you make your way through 4 chapters consisting of a handful of levels to retrieve the elemental stones and put a stop to Phobos' evil plans. The game is for the most part a generic 2D platformer, where you have to dispatch of a bunch of enemies in an area before being able to open the door to the next, until you ultimately reach the door that leads to the level completion screen. Is what I would be saying if the game didn't include a cool ass concept such as elemental guardian girls. Nice. To nobody's surprise, they are the single element that makes this game. You can play as any of the 5 girls you desire, with the R button providing you the option to switch at any given time. Each of the girls has a unique standard A button attack and is also equipped with a B button move that serves as a means to color in the levels. It's actually a pretty fun concept to build your game around that enables you to add some variety to an otherwise pretty fucking standard game. You can choose to demolish your enemies with Will's laser beams or just tornado the hell out of them with Hail In. But the use of the B button is truly what gives this game the charm that it still has. You see, pressing B isn't used to attack enemies, but to overcome obstacles the game throws at you. Whenever there's purple fireballs aggroed at you, you can steer Tyranny's own fireball through them to destroy them. Whenever an object is stuck in an unreachable place, you can use Cornelia's plant powers to reach for it or use Halin's storm power to pull it towards you. The levels make proper use of the character's different elemental powers, and whatever closing portals classifies as, by making it compulsory to use and switch between them. Not only preventing the game from being a tad bit boring, but also preventing you from playing through the entire game with just a single character. though that statement isn't entirely true. Which brings me to the game's glaring flaws in both the characters and the levels trying to utilize them. Look, the ideas of distinguishing the witch girls from one another and making you use all of them for different sections of the levels is great, but there's just such a discrepancy in usefulness that's it's nearly impossible to ignore. Some of the characters are just so much better than the others that you never even care to use the lesser ones, unless the levels prevent you from progressing otherwise. There sadly isn't a single ounce of balance in the usefulness of the characters at all. The worst example of this by a long shot is our water girl Irma. She's the worst character at your disposal and it's not even close. Where you can laser beam the enemies with Will, tornado them with Heilin, or fireball them with Tyranny. All Irma can do is this. Nice. Even with the move at its strongest level, there's just zero range to this attack. It's like when you're trying to use the garden hose, but the hose isn't attached to the tap properly, and thus you get the weakest of weak streams that's closer to a watering can to water flowers than an actual attack. Nice. And then there's her B button attack. Irma has the ability to create this ball of water around her, after which she's able to maneuver herself through, for example, spikes without taking damage. And yeah, the clip you're watching right now is the tutorial of said move, because that's the only time you ever have to use it. It's completely and utterly useless. Now, while Irma is the absolute worst example of this lack of balance between the characters, the rest of the characters sadly suffer from the same issue. I never found myself using any other character than Will for her powerful laser beams that hit every enemy, or Tyranny's fireballs that eventually function as homing missiles and thus require no aiming whatsoever. The others are just inferior to these two in terms of attacks, and their special B button powers are only used a handful of times at most, which is nothing but unfortunate, because I actually think the idea of using the attacks and levels like this is cool as hell, especially for a children's game. Now, I can't really fault the game for the infrequent usage of special powers, while I also most certainly can at the same time. Witch's adventure is only about 3 to 3.5 hours, which is rather short. With there being 5 characters to utilize in a time span of 3 hours, it should come as no surprise that the characters are only required to use their powers once or twice a level. There's simply no room for more in the areas they've designed for this game, and I think that's sadly where they've missed the mark. Whether that's lack of resources, time, motivation, or its underdeveloped brain audience in mind, this game would have benefited from being twice as long at least. It would give them room for more frequent usage of the special power required obstacles, make them more complicated, or even center entire levels around them. That way the concept of these different elemental girls with their unique attacks and moves comes into its own infinitely better. And hell, even with the game in its current state, they could have designed certain enemies that take super effective damage from one of the girl's attacks while resisting the others, or some kinda shit like that. At least then, the infrequent usage of their B button attacks wouldn't have stuck out as much as it currently does. While all of this might seem like I hate the core concept of the game and everything it stands for, let me hit you with the "Nah, mate." I actually think the game plays fine, especially with the intended audience in mind. I enjoyed grabbing items with this plant, watering fires blocking my path, fireballing spiderwebs or opposing fireballs. And even though the enemies don't vary much more than being able to shoot arrows, rolling at you, or simply being a mana draining butterfly, fighting them and having to clear out the entire area with rather basic attacks before being allowed to move on definitely wasn't the worst experience I've ever had. Far from it, actually. Shit's a decent amount of fun, but just could have been so much cooler had they put more effort into utilizing every single thing these girls can currently do. Where the Elemental Guardian gameplay is quite a bit of fun despite its shortcomings and potential to be much better, the actual level design... it's inexcusable. And with this, I'm not even aiming at the aforementioned scarce placement of elemental obstacles or the generic ass looking ass platforms and backgrounds. Despite not being anything out of the ordinary, the levels are actually fine. You make your way through areas such as residential buildings, libraries, offices, and even some caves and volcano-like levels. They're far from the best levels I've ever seen on the Game Boy Advance, and the platforming is nothing but average and basic, but it gets the job done, and that's all that really matters to me. It's the enemies and everything that has to do with them that kept bothering me throughout my entire playthrough. The game's just unfair and some absolute bullshit at times. Now that I've played through this game again as an adult, instead of the 10-year-old kid I was back then, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that I remember this game being hard as hell. Kicking in an open door here, which is obviously a 2D platformer, and being that kind of game comes with its issues. So whenever you enter an area, these enemies will spawn in set places, which doesn't have to be an issue per se. However, if you start on the high ground and are supposed to travel down into the inner depths of, i.e. a cave, you're essentially tasked to fall down into the abyss. And this is where the game's main problem really lies. Whenever you're dropping down, you're unable to see what's below you until it's too late. I can't even count the amount of times I fell down into one or more enemies and took damage as soon as they even appeared on my screen. You're just falling down into the unknown, and they've done nothing to even give you a slight advantage or give you time to adjust your landing spot. No zooming out of the camera to give you a bigger view of the room, or having the witch girl move to the top of the screen to give you some more time to adjust and let the enemies enter your screen. Nothing. And what makes this even worse is that the enemies have collision, which absolutely screws you over even harder. If you happen to land on them, which happens way more often than I'd like to admit, you start bouncing on their head mid-flight like a fucking skippy ball, and it slows down your movement horrendously, making you take even more damage than just once. And then there's Caleb. The first words that come to mind when I think of Caleb in this game are, what's the point? Caleb is a dude. A regular old dude like you and me, without any special powers. He's another main character in the comic and the TV series, where he's the leader of the rebel forces against Phobos, and smashing Cornelia while he's at it, and thus he couldn't be left out of this game, considering his importance to the series. So they gave him a singular level in every single chapter, where you get to play as him and him alone. In every single level, the gameplay pretty much goes like
Let's go!
I wish I was joking when I say this is how I played through every single Caleb level. Caleb is a bit of a normie, and thus gets nothing more than a simple sword and a bow that desperately needs a new string with how long it takes to pull out and shoot. As stupid as the gameplay you're watching right now might seem, it's legit the best way to play these levels. Think of that what you will. The game gives you a few targets to shoot in one tutorial level, but other than that, the game is just never required, and the sword is just much faster and way more effective. You can slice and dice everything that gets in your way in a matter of seconds, with no bow obstacles blocking your path, and the whole defeat all enemies before being allowed to move on rule being absent for some unknown reason. There's no reason not to rush like an absolute madman. The levels aren't bad per se, but with this being the gameplay that does the trick, I ask again, what's the point? The game could have very well done without them, though rampaging my way through these levels got a good chuckle out of me regardless. With all the negative being said, the game actually does have a handful of things going for it. For starters, there's a bunch of items to collect in every single level that work about as well as they could have. Hidden inside of crates, scattered throughout the level, or obtainable by i.e. plant powers, you can find items that'll make you invincible or move at double speed for a short period of time, which are all both useful and have a pretty much perfect duration. And then there's also the character upgrades to collect in every level, that will increase the size and power of Will's laser beam, or transform Tyranny's fireballs into these homing missiles that can then in turn even be upgraded to triple fireball homing missiles. The upgrade tiers are really well designed and truly add a whole lot to overcoming the at times unfair obstacles, making them worth looking for in every level. I also really like the super special combo consumable that you can activate by pressing B while switching characters. Though it activated like half of the time when I wasn't pressing anything, playing a glitch cutscene with a single character as a result, this one-time consumable was a neat idea. Every character combination has its own cool looking cutscene, and the effect of destroying every enemy in range isn't all too bad either. Some of these items are locked behind Blanc. You know, the dude that stole the elemental stones. He's feeling remorse over stealing the stones and trading them for his own gains, so he's decided to help you out in most of the levels. By collecting and giving him something as simple as a pair of glasses or a brush, he will give you any of the consumables as a reward, which is a simple but fun little addition to the game. To prevent me from absolutely losing my shit over the unfair enemies, the girls all have their individual health bars, giving you 30 lives instead of 6, on top of the game handing out health potions on a relatively regular basis. And even if you die, you luckily respawn at the start of whatever area you died in, instead of having to restart the entire level. Now, while I think some of the levels are some grade A unfair bullshit, they at least put some thought into it. Though the lead up to it makes no sense at all, In order to retrieve the stolen elemental stones, the witch girls all get their own levels in the first chapter that essentially function as tutorials to get to know the characters at your disposal. I think that's really cool actually. I really like them having you feel out every single character, teaching you what their purpose in the game is supposed to be. Shit's hella nice and prevents a lot of confusion later on in the game when all elemental obstacles are thrown at you in a random order. Then the boss levels are pretty good as well. Though not being all too hard considering it's a children's game, the ideas behind them are pretty alright. This girl called Ilagon, having a circle of clones around her that functions as a shield that needs to be dealt with first. This red thing shooting spikes at you that need to fall down by using Cornelia's earth powers, after which Haylene can hurl it at him. I like the ideas behind them. Though I have to admit, me not being able to beat the spin boss as a kid. Spin boss? Is nothing short of embarrassing. As a kid, I didn't bother reading the instructions at the start of the level and just tried shooting the thing over and over. When in reality, all you have to do is collect a bunch of spiders and fly past the boss so they attach themselves to the web. This time around, it took me 33 seconds to beat this boss, where it took me weeks as a kid. That's a big yikes, if you ask me. In my defense though, I'll say the tutorial doesn't explain the course of action all that well, and there really aren't any visual cues indicating what to do, other than the boss taking seemingly random damage. But even then, it still baffles me how I was unable to figure this out in my younger years. A child's stupidity is a beautiful thing. Funnily enough, the best of the good is what bothered me the most. At some point, Will over here gets enchanted by a spell, transforming her into an empty shell. So the rest of the witch girls set out on a journey to some ancient mage because they can help her snap out of it. And thus you get to play through a set of levels in which you need to guide Will from area to area. And yeah, these levels are fantastic and easily the best in the entire game. This set of levels are exactly what I want from a game like this. First, you clear out every single enemy so Will can pass through unscathed. Then, after you're done destroying everyone, you can make Will walk with the L button and use nothing but your elemental powers to help her enchanted ass overcome obstacles. Using Irma's water powers on these water wheels to activate moving platforms. Using Cornelia's earth powers to dispatch of boulders. It all feels a lot more functional and rewarding than in the typical witch levels. But what I like even more is the focus on one of the witch girls for entire levels. The absolute focal point of these levels is without a doubt Haylene. Sure, you use the other girls to overcome obstacles, but Haylene is supposed to make Will hover over pools of lava and get her to fly up to elevated platforms and such. It's just hella dope to have an entire chapter dedicated to a single character, with the other available girls playing their own parts in these levels as well. This chapter is a prime example of what I wanted from this game, and while I love playing through these, it also makes me wonder why they didn't design more of these chapters with another girl in the spotlight. Getting to use Haylene for most of the level rather than her being an inferior character was a really nice addition that made me appreciate her as a character a lot more. Having a dedicated chapter like that for every witch girl on top of the regular levels would have elevated this game from being okay to a banger kids game. And with that, I'm just about done overanalyzing a game meant for single-digit age girls. Which is an okay kids game that could have been pretty fucking decent had the developers cared enough to care. Despite being suboptimal, I enjoyed flying around the levels, doing bland-ass elemental tricks and getting screwed over by unfair game design. The elemental guardians are underutilized as hell, and could have been something really cool. But that doesn't mean steering a fireball or closing portals amidst the chaos of enemies wasn't fun or anything. I just feel like it could have been a lot better, especially with the Haylin chapter being as fun as it is. And I mean, it's not like the game does everything half-assed either. The bosses are really cool, the items are relatively balanced, the music actually bangs way harder than it ever should have, and I even fuck with the corny ending where the elemental girls are captured by Phobos, and his sister that had been under his mind control for the entirety of the game frees them through the power of friendship. Whether fueled by nostalgia or not, the game's just fun for what it is, and with 3.5 hours of gameplay, it doesn't overstay its welcome either. It's just a fun little kids game that doesn't have any aspirations to be something extraordinarily good, and it gets the job done well enough. I would most certainly recommend this game to a kid, even with all of its glaring limitations and basic design at times. Is what I would say if this wasn't a Disney-backed game. Shout out to Climax though, that's a funny ass name. Disney completely fucked over the Witch creators by making everything about marketing, quantity over quality, and leaving no room for them to progress professionally and artistically, on top of obtaining the rights to the series that is. Even with this being a semi-enjoyable but half-assed game, I just cannot recommend a game that stems from a horrible publisher milking every last drop out of something that isn't theirs, that they obtained by fucking over the creators of said something that isn't theirs in more ways than should be legal. This game is a part of my childhood. A part of my childhood that I have good memories of in fact, and thus was deserving of its own semi-serious video. I'm moderately satisfied with how it turned out, and I'm glad I still enjoyed playing the game after this many years, even with its shortcomings. But the entire history and development between the series as a whole, it just leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Fuck corporate greed. Wings Club's better anyway.